This is the fourth episode of a series on infrastructures. This is a series of 4 interviews to people based or coming from Ireland, Finland, France, Denmark, and the United States. My main focus is in understanding the possible role of design in relation to infrastructures. I started this inquiry interviewing designers involved in the development of services for projects. I wanted to ask them what can we design in relation to the work of infrastructures. I work for ICOS, a research infrastructure that provides standardized and open data from close to 180 measurement stations across 16 European countries. This is why I wanted to identify and map in this series some of the designers working on infrastructures and especially in climate change related issues. Today I interview Max Stearns, a designer that has for a long time worked in the intersection between participatory design and climate. He also works in European research projects in relation to the mitigation and adaptation to climate change. In this interview, we talk about one of these projects, Net Zero Cities, about democratic infrastructures, citizen participation, and design research. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
I'm Max Stearns. I'm Senior Design Manager for Democratic Society. My work is particularly focused around supporting the design research, design strategy, service design, transition design, kind of robust set of design work that we do in our efforts to enable cities, communities, governments, institutions to incorporate and to embed democratic processes as part of their approach to decision-making, more generally in an effort to support a more flourishing future of democracies.
Okay, and what did you study?
I studied a mix. So my undergraduate, I studied political theory and economics. And then I did a year of law school, which was intriguing and very interesting, but also a really useful opportunity to recognize that in spite of the fact that so much of the challenges that I'm curious about, even though so many of them are deeply intertwined with law, policy, and legal thinking, that the actual process of working as a lawyer was one that I wasn't exactly cut out for, or rather that engaged me and excited me in the same way as design. And so after all of that, and I did some years in between, but I went on to study transdisciplinary design at the Parsons School of Design at the New School.
Perfect. But now you're living in Europe, right?
Correct. Yeah, I live in France now. So I spent a number of years living in Boston, New York, and have since relocated to France.
Okay. So one of the topics that you were working on was in these democratic infrastructures.
Correct. Yes.
Could you tell me what does it mean, democratic infrastructures?
Democratic infrastructures is a core concept to the work that democratic society is doing right now. And it's not necessarily an idea that has a robust academic literature behind it at this point, but it's one that's growing in conversation and one that we're trying to contribute to as much as we can. And basically, democratic infrastructures is pulling from the ways that infrastructure, which for many people is a hardcore physical idea. You know, it's your sidewalks, it's your stop signs, it's all these kind of things. It's recognizing that more and more we're talking about infrastructure as the kind of enabling factors, enabling tools that equip us to take on particular efforts or to pursue particular avenues. And in some ways, infrastructures also support status quo behaviors that we have as well. So when we're talking about democratic infrastructures, we're really talking about kind of socio-political, technological, economic infrastructures, whether those are tangible or intangible, that enable how we practice democracy. And when we think about this, we think about a few things. We think about governance structures and replicable models. We think about communities and relationships and networks in their capacity to support democracy. We think about supportive legal doctrine that ensures or enshrines certain rights and standards for the practice of democracy. But we're kind of constantly playing with this idea in an effort to work it out more fully. But the idea really is to step away from the idea of being an organization that designs processes or services that can address one moment of democracy. So, for example, a citizens' assembly or a mini public or something like this, which is incredibly useful. But if you're just looking at it through the lens of one event, its design, we're missing the bigger picture of how do we design the infrastructure that can support a more robust and flourishing democracy. And so that's what we think about.
So give me an example in which this infrastructure as a concept has helped you to design something new.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're doing in a project called the Net Zero Cities, the full name escapes me now, but it's the Net Zero Cities mission is what we're thinking of it as. And this is all about moving cities to climate neutrality by 2030. And what we've done as an organization, what I've done particularly as the head of design, is to try and think about when we're supporting cities with the kind of services that we're developing, whether these are services to help them identify gaps in how they're engaging publics on the conversation of climate change and climate action or climate mitigation, or it's service or it's processes that they want to carry out, or whatever it might be, that we're equipping all of our team to ask a set of questions that explore not just what they're trying to do with that one plan, but what is the state of democracy in the city itself, for example. So how many networks exist that are part of or participating in the ways that democracy is practiced, particularly on the issue of climate mitigation? So are there different groups that are coalescing and working with government or contributing to the way decisions are being made? Are there existing institutions or governance practices related to, well, do you have a standing citizens assembly or do you have a climate assembly, or do you have something or a history of these kinds of models for practicing? And if not, part of what we're training our team to do is to work with experts from the city, teams from the city, and not just individuals from government, but also trying to build robust teams from across the city to build out some of these different infrastructures. So in Madrid, there's been a ton of work done by a colleague of mine who was really focused on how do we build networks, how do we not just, they were working on new materials and renewable materials for buildings and renovation. And they were thinking about how do we not just do that, but how do we build a diverse network of individuals and groups from across the city who have a vested interest in this, who can then not just be involved for this one project, but then can be a contributing force for the longer term. And what's happened is that one project has turned into two, into three, and it's meant that there is actually not just one set of activities happening, but multiple. And so when we're talking about democratic infrastructure, that network all of a sudden became a real infrastructure for the city to say, okay, well, we did one project, and actually we already have networks in place to help us work on and think through these other projects in a really thoughtful, democratic way, so we can rely on that infrastructure.
What does it mean that a network become an infrastructure?
In the sense that, I don't know if I would say it became an infrastructure, it is an infrastructure, in the sense that I think about like cables that help us make phone calls or that have our internet. Like this kind of infrastructure is really hardcore.
Like the physical infrastructure.
The physical infrastructure, exactly. You need this to be able to make a phone call, to be able to access your email. And I think that what we're saying is that networks are infrastructure insofar as it is very hard to practice democracy in a way that can extend beyond a single moment and can actually be sustained without infrastructure like a network, without networks of organizations and people who are committed not just to getting things done, not just to outcomes, but to process, that are committed to working together, committed to understanding each other, committed to bringing out positions that otherwise wouldn't be talked about. And I think that it's incredibly challenging to get those kind of things done democratically without networks in place. So those networks become an essential conduit for democratic function at its best. So that's what I mean when I'm saying that it is an infrastructure.
And what are the interventions that, as a designer, we need these concrete steps, things that we do in Net Zero City, for example, to reinforce these infrastructures and networks?
I think that there's a few things. The one that comes most to mind has a lot to do with thinking about third places or third spaces and placemaking. And it's an idea that we didn't create, but we've been really incorporating into our approach now, which is spaces of encounter. And it's the idea that you can design physical and digital and otherwise spaces in which people can come into contact with each other, and they can begin to have dialogue, and they can begin to understand each other, and they can begin to see each other not as some kind of stereotype of a polarity that they disagree with, but rather as human beings that have experiences in day-to-day lives that have shaped why they believe the position they have. So spaces for encounter, you can design, I'm thinking about not just spatial design. So you can say, okay, what kind of space, whether it's a library, a park, some kind of social infrastructure in the kind of sense of like spaces where people can come together, but how do you design that space so people can feel connected? And there's this really simple kind of almost cliche example at this point, especially in the facilitation circles, but it's like, if you're going to have a discussion, rather than having a conversation which somebody's facilitating from the front and then you have layers and layers of chairs back, having a circle. I mean, this is a really almost silly example to give at this point, because it's almost like, yeah, of course you would do this, but that's a really intentional and important design decision in which you're saying everyone here is equal, everyone here is part of a conversation, you're all going to contribute. So those kind of simple but important design decisions can come into play, in addition to how you facilitate and how you kind of continue the conversation.
But in these situations in which you are working together with policymakers of the city, right? Because I guess that in net zero cities, you have a lot of work with policymakers. And a lot of this work, it does not happen necessarily in physical spaces, right? You also have a lot of virtual meetings. And so how this placemaking goes there?
I think that it's a really interesting question, and it's a challenging one, but I think it's one that the answer to it has radically changed since the COVID-19 pandemic, when everybody had to just immediately come up with radical solutions to how you could meet online. And I think for me personally, one of the things that has been most transformative about understanding how you design these kind of spaces is how you can leverage what an online forum offers that an in-person doesn't. So in person, if I'm facilitating a process like this, there's only one conversation more or less happening at a time. And you might have some people talking to each other in the back or around and kind of having side conversations, but those are really private. And if you're using a tool like Zoom or Teams or something like this, you enable a conversation where you can have multiple dialogues happening simultaneously. You can have the conversation we're having, and then you can also have a chat that's happening where you're able to make that conversation potentially more accessible to people that need to read questions, to be able to source and look at resources at the same time. You're able to recognize doubts, because sometimes people are more comfortable typing their critique than speaking out loud. And so you can enable the conversation to occur in ways that it otherwise wouldn't. And I think that for me and colleagues that I've worked with, that's a real privilege that the online forum offers. But I think that getting people online is the challenging piece, because I think it's easier to meet people where you are in person, like show up at a park where you know people are going to be, than to say, you have to log in online here. And so I think we're playing with ways that you can make spaces for encounter digitally that meet people where they are.
But which are the type of things that you discuss in these encounters? Are you really discussing things in relation to bringing cities into climate neutrality with the citizens? Or what's the point of these encounters?
I mean, I think that it depends on the context of the city. So in one way, how much polarization are you talking about? How are you dealing with in a city? And does that mean you need to start from a place of just building community, just building a shared sense of, I can see this person who has a different opinion than me as still valid, and I can start to try and come up with ways to understand why they might feel the way they do. If you're in a city that has perhaps less polarization or more precedent of an experience where people are kind of more in communication with each other, then these spaces for encounter can be a place to engage in conversation about the technicalities of a proposal. You could be talking about transforming a mobility system, and maybe that has implications on parking or car allotments. And so there's always, I worked for a long time for several years in Boston, in the city of Boston, and parking was always a hot button issue. But you need a place to have these conversations. Otherwise, people are just we talked about the digital kind of situation. And we're dealing in a time where a lot of people just find their bubbles and they deepen their perspectives. And so what you're really trying to do is create a sense of just basic, we can have a conversation at first, and then escalating the kind of conversation that you can have, or deepening in some ways the magnitude of the decisions that can be made. But I also think it could be as, one of the ways that I've seen it done, and we did it in Boston when I was there, was spaces for encounter as a space for design research, space where people could come together and you could use design probes, or you could facilitate different kinds of world cafes or conversations, playing with them, having them imagine. And all of a sudden, these become really powerful, both opportunities to connect people, because I'm a big believer that design research done effectively, focusing on it as process, not just outcomes, enables you to create community through that. But it also unleashes a lot of creativity about what the future could be. So there's a few different roles that this can play, and a lot of it comes down to where's the city at? What do they need to build? What are they trying to work on? And how do we start from where they're at and progress from there?
So, because I asked you about the role of design, and then you told me about this placemaking and these spaces for intervention, and then now we are talking about design research. So when we think in these EU projects as the net zero cities, how do you see the design research? What can we do with that?
If I'm being completely honest, I think that there's a misunderstanding of what design research is, and at worst, an extreme undervaluing of what design research is. Because I think that there's a lot of the projects we work on, Net Zero Cities as well, has a call to develop lots of services, platforms, opportunities to engage directly with citizens as well as folks in government as well. And I know as a designer that you can do those things, but you have to have an effective understanding of who you're designing for, what their needs are, where they're operating at.
So all these encounters, they are not just encounters to create a community, but they are also in order to bring research and qualitative research to the projects, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think that that's the key. And I think that that's part of it is recognizing, for me, especially as a design researcher, the process is the outcome. So when you design a space like this in which you can practice design research, you are gaining insight that you need to be able to design the effective services that we're meant to design. But you're also building community. That community is both an outcome and a part of the process. So I'm constantly looking at these kind of projects and thinking there's such a great opportunity to integrate really rigorous and thorough design research that isn't necessarily taken advantage of, whether it's because we need to move really quickly and get things done, or whatever else might be the mentality. But you're really missing a great opportunity, because you're going to do better things quicker if you do the kind of design research you need.
So it's going beyond just facilitation, right? Because for design researchers, there are other factors and other elements that are key here, right?
I think when it comes to working on climate, a big part of it, as we're talking about what are we designing for citizens and enabling citizens to be part of the process and to take action, is understanding why are they conducting the current behaviors. So if you're in the government and you're thinking, we can't get to climate neutrality because people won't do the thing we want them to do. Well, there's a lot of reasons why they're doing what they're already doing, whether that's kind of a behavioral component or the enabling conditions that surround them. I think I'm a big believer that we produce the system we produce based on the infrastructures that surround us, based on the affordances, based on how we've been designed to do the things we do. And so I think the question that a design researcher brings is, what have we designed and how is that designing the way people do things? We've designed cars, we've designed highways, we've designed everything this way.
And do you have any concrete example indeed you could design something and change a certain behavior?
Well, I think that we've been looking at a couple of cities that are thinking about building on existing digital platforms that they have, like basically in Boston, it's 311. Lots of people already have the app downloaded. They use it.
What is this 311?
311 is in the US, a lot of cities you can call 311, or at least that's how it had been. You could call 311 and you could ask a non-emergency city-related question or report something. Okay, there's potholes, there's issues around here. Boston was at the forefront of this, but they developed an app. Many others have developed them as well. But so that you can do that digitally on your phone, you can see a pothole, take a picture, use your geolocation to say, there's a pothole here, please fix it, and a city crew will come out and fix it. So you've got a lot of people, you've got a user base, and a lot of cities have digital tools like this or mobile applications where they've got a substantial number of users, and they're curious about how do we encourage climate positive behaviors, climate mitigating behaviors and actions, or just encouraging people to participate in processes. And constantly, the point that we're coming back to is saying, well, do you understand why the users of this phone might not be acting in the way that you think they need to be, whether that's using different sources of energy or using different transportation systems or what have you. And so we're really trying to say what you need to do is deeper design research to understand the factors at play that are holding them in that same status quo behavior. So understanding, well, because of these forces, these institutions, the way that they're billed for gas or the way that the parking situation is or transportation, they're incentivized to keep doing the same thing. But if you just say, okay, we're just going to encourage cities to, we want to use our app and tell citizens, you have to do it like this. Here's a better way to do it. And we'll encourage you to do that. We'll, give you a digital high five or something like that. Like that. Is that enough of a incentive for somebody who's got a kind of groove for how they do things? And so you need to actually engage with people before you design an app that's meant to move people to behave in a different way or to take different actions. You need to understand why they're acting in the ways that we need to change.
But could you use this app in order to elicit a certain behavior that you wanted?
I think that apps can have a lot of impact if you've got a lot of users. I'm hesitant about how effective they always are. I don't think they can't work. I just think you have to design them really effectively. And I think a lot of times they are designed using they're a solution that doesn't know really what the problem is yet. And so there's a bit of a challenge in their effectiveness there. But I think that depending on what you're doing, in Boston, we were trying to change road behaviors because Boston is sort of renowned for, or was renowned for, not necessarily dangerous drivers, but aggressive driving. And so we made an app that would keep tabs, and it was a competition. We gamified basically to say who could be the safest driver, Boston's safest driver. And you would win a prize if you were at the top of the leaderboard. And it was based on, were you taking appropriate speed? Were you kind of doing all these different things? And it was effective. We saw a statistically significant impact in how people were driving, who were using it. But that phrasing is important. Not everybody's using it. And if you want to make an impact, especially on climate, you need a huge sample size of people within your city or your community to be using an app like this. So the limit of its effectiveness has a lot to do with how many people are using it, how effectively. But I think, DemSoc, part of the challenge about talking about design in the DemSoc democratic society setting is that we do a lot of process design, which is much more intangible in terms of what we're designing than a classic digital product design or UX design. So that's more where I think there's a lot of design decisions being made by me and by folks on our team is how to design a process of a citizens assembly or a climate assembly so that you have a diverse set of folks involved from across the city. You have viewpoints of potentially marginalized perspectives present. You have folks from government, you have folks from academia, corporate side, and you run a process in which they can engage in a conversation about what do we need to do meaningfully, but they can also engage in a sort of design research project of understanding what is the issue that we need to address and understanding it from the diversity of perspectives that are present. I think that's where democracy design research really come into a relationship with each other, is that to do the best designs, you need to understand a problem as thoroughly as possible and as kind of from as many angles as possible. And that's really hard to do if you don't have everyone affected by that design solution or artifact present. And when you take a democratic approach, you're going to have the folks in the room or the perspectives in the room that will be affected by the process, the outcome, the policy, whatever it is, there to provide perspective and input on, well, you're saying maybe we should change the law in this way, but that would really negatively affect our community exclusively. So now you know that, and you have to kind of amend the design to address that.
This interview is part of the list D&D in English, Democracia y Diseño, Infrastructures, y Gobierno y Diseño. The lists can be found in Spotify, in our website, and in YouTube. We do a lot of process design which is intangible, says Max. This is especially true for those working as service designers, strategic designers, or policy designers. This is not easy to explain, and in many organizations, they do not know how to make use of these design capabilities that relate to these intangible outcomes. And also, in many cases, it is difficult to tell what is the difference once a designer is involved in the development of collaborations, processes, strategies, or interventions. We use certain methods, but we all know it's not about the methods. We rely on participatory approaches and non-hierarchical ways of doing, but many others could also do it. There is, however, a certain intentionality, consistency, and coherence in doing this in a designed way. Techniques and methods are not chosen by chance, and there is a care in the details that make these spaces for collaboration especially useful for the challenges in question. Let's continue listening to Max, that he has a lot more to tell us. So, for example, you organize one of these climate assemblies, and who are the ones that are asking you to organize that? It's which context? Because I think it is completely different if you are doing that for and together with policymakers, that you are doing that as a non-profit organization, right?
Yeah, and I think that our work is predominantly with government entities. So, we did a project with the city of Vienna, the Vienna Climate Assembly, which was brought about it was kind of an iteration of work that we had been doing through the Healthy Clean Cities initiative.
This relates to the work that you have done on climate participatory budget.
Yes, exactly. And so it's in that setting, the city was looking to shift the way that it was making decisions. It was responding to pressures that it had felt, but it was also responding to demonstrable evidence that indicates decisions that are made democratically with people, whether that's participatory budgeting or other participatory or deliberative approaches, have the capacity to be sustained, to be adopted, or adopted more quickly and sustained for longer periods, because people are part of the process. They aren't surprised when a decision arrives to them. They were part of that decision making, so they feel that it's their decision, it's their investment in the case of a participatory budget. And so the city itself wanted to take this approach, and that was where we came in, was to support the design, implementation, evaluation, and kind of the development. And I think that's the important part of this is, like you're saying, we aren't just doing this because we like democracy and we're just organizing events to do it. We're doing it with partners in policy and in government and elsewhere, where we've also worked in non-governmental organizations that are trying to think about how they can incorporate democratic governance models. But it's really that we come in and help them think about, how do you design this process so that you can get an outcome, not necessarily knowing what the outcome will be, that's emergent, that comes from the process, but an outcome that you can be confident will take action. In Vienna, this was thinking about climate, so that you can be confident that there will be action that is going to move towards mitigating climate change, but that can be an approach that is shaped by the needs and expectations and values of the people within the city. And so that's where we can step in to support. And yeah, that's why I do tend to think that a lot of what we're doing is I think democratic theorists would be furious with me if I called a mini public a design research approach. It's its own thing, but I think it is in a lot of ways. When you have designers present, you can bring a different intentionality and a different set of methods and insights to it.
Perfect. What are you inspired by? What do you read, listen, watch in relation to these topics? What do you recommend?
I think my perspective has been shaped by some all over the place kind of things. I think there's a few books that I pulled out because you had asked ahead of time. I can kind of share them a little bit. I think the first one that I really thought about was How Artifacts Afford by Jenny Davis. I think this book is, whether you're a designer trying to think about the totality of impacts you can make with your design decisions, or if you're somebody not familiar with design who's just trying to understand what might happen if I make a process look like this or an app look like that. This book is such a powerful way to say, consider who you're designing for, what their current conditions are, and what you're trying to afford, what you're really trying to get them to do. When it comes to infrastructure, there's two books that I think they're related that were really helpful, and that's the Uses of Disorder by Richard Sennett and the Designing Disorder, Experiments in Disruption in the City by Pablo Sendra and Richard Sennett. And this book in particular, Designing Disorder, I don't necessarily advocate, and in my own work, I don't try to produce disorder, but I think what it does is raises this question about infrastructure and the ways that different tangible, hard kind of structural infrastructure and also social infrastructures can shape the way a city operates, can shape the way that democracy happens. If you have social expectations for a city and physical infrastructure that separates communities, it's much harder for those communities to come into contact naturally and understand and relate to each other. You essentially create borders. And so part of what it talks about is how you can create these kind of different but similar versions of spaces for encounter. And I think this book is a fantastic way to think about that. Should I recommend any others, or should we keep going?
No, I think with that we are fine. Thank you. So now we can go to the last question. It's about the future. Where do you think your future practice is going?
The conversation about infrastructure is really an important one because it points at the idea that how things happen in the city, and you name a field and they're talking about the infrastructures that exist within it. Infrastructures, we're talking about democratic infrastructure. People are talking about infrastructures for disorder. People are talking about infrastructures for internet, all these things. And I think what they're all pointing at is that there are things we have designed, structural things that we have designed, artifacts, which have profound impacts on how we do what we do and why we do what we do. They are, in a way, kind of like world-building artifacts. They shape what it is that our world is. And I think by engaging in that conversation, we can shift away from thinking just about people just do what they do because that's how they are, to really saying, well, what have we built that shapes why they don't care about climate, or shapes why they do care about climate, or why they work together, or why they don't work together. And I think, again, this conversation about infrastructure gives us an opportunity to say, well, let's get at that. Let's think about what can we do to shift the very nature by which we can practice democracy in ways that is not necessarily just polarized conflict, and instead is a way to find compromise, to find agreeable approaches to take action. And so I think the future of my design practice, but I think a lot of people's design practice who operate on climate, who operate on this kind of scale of design, is thinking about those bigger, more tectonic plates that shape how our system operates. Because we're all a lot of us are thinking about how do we shift, how do we move towards a future that's thriving, where people have opportunity, where people can be connected, and a future where people can be equitably able to flourish. And I think to get there, we need to think about what's the infrastructure we need to support us actually behaving in that way and being with each other in that way. And so that's, for us, democratic infrastructure. But I think more generally, just thinking about the infrastructures of the existing systems and the infrastructures we need for our future ones.
Thanks a lot for the interview. This exploration on models of participation in relation to climate not only makes decision-making more open and democratic, but also motivates citizens to be more informed and have more agency in climate-related topics. This is why I love to know about this project in relation to participatory budget in the city of Vienna. And related to this, Max poses two questions: how social infrastructures can shape the way in which cities operate, and how can we move towards a future in which people can be connected and able to drive change? Max sees the potential of design research in answering these questions and arguments for it in this interview. He explains about designing spaces for encounters and how these spaces are hosting conversation and providing opportunities to research by doing together, or research by co-designing. My design practice goes in line with the one that Max does. So for me, it is easy to relate to his and his colleagues' work. I also put a lot of effort and care in every interaction on how to build conversations that could be the seeds of research and development work. Sometimes, and in certain situations, this is seen as just facilitation, when in fact is setting the table for design to happen. And if we are setting the table, we are also designing the whole experience around the gathering. We take the crafting of hosting seriously. Similar to the work I also do while hosting interviews for this podcast, setting the stage for meaningful conversation in design work. Design work that allows me to use the podcast as a research tool to dig in the topics that need to be explored for my work, in this case, infrastructures. As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman. Sound design is by Julian Pereira. This podcast is published with Creative Commons licenses with attributions. This series is part of the work I do for the EU project iRisk, Integrated Research Infrastructure Services for Climate Change Risks. In this project, we will develop services using a co-design framework. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Till next time, goodbye and design some more.